6. The Bismarck. The Bismarck was a German battleship that saw combat during World War II. It's one of the most famous and powerful warships of all time. The Bismarck is famously known for its involvement in Operation Rheinebung. The mission, which took place in May 1941, sought to disrupt Allied shipping lines in the Atlantic Ocean. During this operation, the Bismarck sank the British battlecruiser HMS Hood, but in the process, it was also heavily damaged and was in need of repairs. After sinking the HMS Hood, the Bismarck rose to the top of the priority target list for the British Royal Navy, since they saw it as a massive threat to their remaining ships. This was especially true after such a ship as renowned as the HMS Hood was taken down so easily. As a result, the British forces threw the entirety of their strength behind efforts to bring the Bismarck down, as it was relentlessly pursued by both battleships and aircraft. The Bismarck was eventually disabled by British torpedoes. Unable to escape, it was decisively scuttled by its own crew on May 27, 1941. The Bismarck wallowed in its watery grave for almost 50 years, until June 8, 1989, when Dr. Robert Ballard and his team located the wreckage. It was approximately 600 miles west of the French city of Brest. The ship's final resting place was found 15,700 feet under the sea's surface. Despite the decades of time that had passed and the massive attack against it, the Bismarck is surprisingly still in amazing condition. The vessel was in an upright position on the seabed, firmly embedded inside layers of mud and silt. This is pretty impressive considering the extensive damage the warship sustained from British shellfire and torpedo attacks, not to mention the force the ship hit the seabed. The impact could be comparable to a high-speed train slamming into a mountain at full force. With this in mind, it's surprising that the Bismarck's remains have held up so well. Except for a section of the stern that broke off, the main hull remains mostly intact, as well as a majority of the secondary battery turrets and anti-aircraft guns. The same can be said for the forward conning tower and bridge, despite suffering substantial damage in its final battle. Even remnants of intricate woodwork and paint are still visible on the wreck's surface, things that are normally the first to go over time. Despite never reaching its full potential on the surface of the water, the Bismarck will continue to hold the fascination of historians for many years to come. 5. HMS Victory. The HMS Victory was designed by Sir Thomas Slade and built at Chatham Dockyard in 1759. This vessel was one of the largest ever built for its time, with over 2,000 oak trees used in the construction of the ship's hull alone, which would have required nearly 60 acres of forest to be cut down. The final cost of the project was £63,176, which would be well over £50 million today, or approximately $63.7 million. The ship had 104 guns, 27 miles of rigging, and a massive 4 acres of sail. Considering her large size, she could have easily sailed faster than any of the smaller ships around her, thanks to her revolutionary hull design. Despite the sheer size, cost, and majesty of the ship, the decision to call it HMS Victory wasn't a popular one. The name had been plagued with disaster, and just 15 years before, the previous HMS Victory sank in the English Channel and killed everyone unlucky enough to still be on board. The new HMS Victory was officially launched on May 7, 1765, but she saw her first bit of action as a commission ship almost 13 years later in March 1778, when she took part in the War of American Independence, which happened between 1775 to 83. After getting a refit, HMS Victory was once again back in action 10 years later in 1793 as the flagship for Vice Admiral Lord Hood. The same year, the ship joined an alliance of British and Spanish ships that were trying to capture Toulon, but in the end they gave in to French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte's crew and relinquished the French port. The next year, in 1794, Victory played a role in another showdown, this time in France's Calvi. The HMS Victory was part of the British fleet that officially kicked the French out of Corsica. After some additional upgrades in the winter of 1794, Victory went back to the Mediterranean as a flagship under Sir John Jervis, who led it into the Battle of Cape St. Vincent on February 14, 1797. The ship was a complete juggernaut at the start of the battle, disabling and damaging countless enemy ships. It took a heavy beating though, and by the end of 1797, Victory was finally sent back home as a floating hospital for injured troops. The most famous captain of the HMS Victory was a legendary commander named Horatio Nelson, who used the vessel in an assault against a French fleet. The Victory was used by Nelson from 1803 until 1805 in the pivotal Battle of Trafalgar. Although Nelson didn't survive the battle despite winning, the HMS Victory was heavily damaged. She returned home with Nelson's body and underwent repairs. But thanks to sentimentality as Nelson's last warship and her legendary status after serving over 40 years at sea, HMS Victory was never deployed again and was instead docked in Portsmouth Harbor. It was later converted into a tourist attraction. HMS Victory can still be found in Portsmouth to this day, although she's been moved to a dry dock to make sure she can last for generations to come. 4. The Yamato. One of the most feared battleships in the Pacific Theater was known as the Yamato. The Yamato and its sister ship the Musashi were two of the heaviest and most heavily armored battleships ever built by Japan. They were constructed as part of rearmament efforts in the 1930s. When fully loaded, the Yamato had a length of 863 feet and a displacement around 72,800 tons. When it came to firepower, the Yamato had quite the arsenal. It was equipped with 9 18.1-inch main guns that were arranged in 3 triple turrets. At that point in time, they were the largest naval guns ever mounted on a battleship. These guns were capable of firing projectiles over vast distances and causing significant damage. The Yamato was deployed extensively in World War II. It served during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, where it was part of the Japanese fleet's attempt to disrupt Allied landings in the Philippines. But things didn't go as planned for Japan, and the Yamato was unable to achieve its goals. This didn't stop the Yamato from being any less of a threat though, and on April 7, 1945, it was part of Operation Tengo, a desperate last-ditch attempt by Japanese troops to defend Okinawa. The ship was attacked by overwhelming numbers of American aircraft, and it was eventually hit by multiple bombs and torpedoes. The resulting explosions led to the ship sinking. Many of its crew died in the attack. The wreck of the Yamato was later discovered in 1985 by American oceanographer Robert Ballard, the same man who found the wreck of the Bismarck a few years later. It currently rests on the seafloor off the coast of Japan. What would you do if you found a shipwreck? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe while you're at it. 3. The Scharnhorst. The Scharnhorst was a German Navy battleship, but it's typically referred to as a battle cruiser because of its relatively higher speed and lighter armor compared to traditional battleships. The Scharnhorst was launched in 1936. It was part of a class made up of 2 ships, with the other being the Gneisenau. The Scharnhorst had a displacement weight of 38,000 tons and was armed with 9 11-inch main guns, lighter anti-aircraft guns, and secondary armaments. In April 1940, at the start of World War II, the Scharnhorst and its sister ship Gneisenau participated in the invasion of Norway, or Operation Weserübung. During this mission, the ships targeted Norwegian coastal defenses and helped secure critical ports for German forces. After the successful occupation of Norway, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau started their commerce raiding missions in the North Atlantic. Their goal was to disrupt Allied supply lines by attacking convoys and merchant ships. Their speed allowed them to evade capture and inflict heavy damage on shipping routes, meaning that they were menaces on the waves. The Scharnhorst's involvement in Arctic convoy operations meant it was in direct conflict with Allied naval forces. In December 1943, during the Battle of the Barents Sea, the Scharnhorst tried to intercept a convoy heading for the Soviet Union, but it was met by British naval forces, mainly the battleship HMS Duke of York. After a fierce battle, the Scharnhorst was eventually sunk on December 26, 1943. 2. USS Enterprise CV6. The USS Enterprise was commissioned in 1938 and spent much of her deployment in the Pacific Ocean. This led to the vessel being the very first warship to sink a Japanese warship, the submarine I-70, only 3 days after the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. In April 1942, the Enterprise supported the Doolittle raid on Japan and in June of that same year, she was an integral part of the Battle of Midway, where with the help of the aircraft stationed on board, she was able to take out 3 Japanese carriers and a cruiser. During the Guadalcanal campaign, she participated in the battles of the Eastern Solomons and the Santa Cruz Islands. Despite being damaged in both, she launched aircraft to help other ships, proving that she could still keep fighting. The USS Enterprise wasn't done yet though, since her list of feats and engagements during World War II's Pacific Theater kept growing. From the latter part of 1943 through the start of 1944, the Enterprise played a role in the invasions of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, as well as conducting air assaults against Japanese targets in the Pacific. During the summer of 1944, the ship was involved in the Marianas Operation and the Battle of the Philippine Sea. After this, it participated in the historic Battle of Lake Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, in October. Moving into February 1945, the Enterprise contributed during the Iwo Jima invasion, subsequently engaging in raids on the Japanese mainland and participating in the Okinawa campaign in April. Because of the damage taken on by 2 kamikaze attacks in April and May, she returned to the United States. Sadly, though, USS Enterprise wouldn't do much else in her post-war years, and despite efforts to turn her into a museum, she was finally sold for scrapping in July 1958. 1. HMS Hood. The HMS Hood is probably one of the most famous ships from the entire 20th century. Built as a flagship between the 2 world wars, her fate was intertwined with another behemoth of the seas. At the time she was laid down, HMS Hood was the largest battle cruiser ever built, making it the world's largest warship, and it stayed the largest until the Queen Elizabeth class of aircraft carriers came around in 2017. The ship stood as a symbol of Britain's strength and global influence and soon became famous around the world. The HMS Hood was a huge source of pride for the Royal Navy, and because of this, it was run by the very best men and commanders the fleet had to offer. It participated in fleet-wide exercises around the globe, showing up the other ships with its gunmanship, expertise, and innate ability to command the waves. The HMS Hood was the natural choice to lead the Special Service Squadron on the Empire Cruise, which visited ports across Africa, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and even the United States. As the Second World War broke out in 1939, Hood had already served about 20 years in commission. Thanks to its massive size and because it had been incredibly busy touring around the world, the Hood wasn't able to get any upgrades or refits for the new conflict. But newer battleships were being commissioned left and right that were equipped with armor reflecting 2 decades of advancements that easily put the defenses of HMS Hood to shame. Even still, HMS Hood held her own. In the Battle of Mers el Kabir in July 1940, Hood was tasked with taking out the French battleships, which had been taken over by enemy forces when the country was initially invaded. The HMS Hood handled the task easily, inflicting heavy damage on the French fleet. When the Allies learned that the German ship the Bismarck had been launched and was attacking merchant vessels in the Atlantic, it was no surprise that they called upon the Hood to end its reign of terror. The ship's speed meant it was able to quickly catch up to the newly built German battleship, and soon it was facing off the Bismarck and its companion ship Prinz Eugen. Hood wasn't alone though, since one of the newer warships in the Royal Navy fleet, the Prince of Wales, accompanied it to help out. The battle took place in the Denmark Strait, which is situated between Iceland and Greenland. The engagement was quick and brutal. A single German shell managed to penetrate a weak spot in the HMS Hood's armor, setting off a catastrophic explosion that wrecked the ship and took the lives of about 1,415 men on board. Technical difficulties forced the Prince of Wales to disengage from the fight, although after what just happened to HMS Hood, this was probably a smart move. Stunned by the sheer loss of what had been the flagship of their fleet, the Royal Navy started a relentless manhunt to find and take down the Bismarck, sinking it only 3 days later. But many people still wonder how this battle would have turned out if the HMS Hood had had the same upgrades as the newer warships in the fleet. The Night Stalkers. The United States Army's 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment is an elite group with many harrowing accomplishments under its belt. Nicknamed the Night Stalkers, These accolades include transporting the Navy SEALs who killed Osama bin Laden in 2011, as well as their participation in the Battle of Mogadishu in 1993, which inspired the movie Black Hawk Down. The Night Stalkers also participated in a lesser-known mission called Operation Mount Hope III, which took place at the end of an equally little-known conflict called the Toyota War. So, exactly what is it that makes the Night Stalkers so great at what they do? Established in 1981, this Special Operations Force consists of some of the US Army's best aviators, crew chiefs, and support soldiers. Those who are skilled enough to be assigned to the 160th endure intensive training to prepare them for the high-stakes missions that they can expect to encounter throughout the remainder of their military career. During their training, members focus on advancing their skills in 5 key areas of combat: first responder, land navigation, combatives, weapons, and teamwork. Each soldier who becomes a full-fledged Night Stalker can expect to fire thousands of rounds during their training alone, using weapons including AK-47 style rifles, Beretta M9 pistols, M4/M4A1 carbines, and Sig Sauer M17/M18 pistols. Recruits who fail their initial training are given the option to retake it, but there's never any guarantee of making it into the 160th. Each round of initial training lasts 5 weeks, while the training to become an officer lasts for anywhere from 20 to 28 weeks. A Night Stalker pilot is expected to undergo a specific round of qualifications testing in order to become fully mission qualified, or FMQ. Pilots who receive FMQ status typically remain in that rank for 3 to 5 years before they're eligible to try out for flight lead qualification. Simply put, in order to become a Night Stalker, a soldier needs to really know their stuff. And it isn't just about passing the initial tests, but about keeping up with the requirements over time and proving that you've still got it. This is why the 160th was specifically chosen for Operation Mount Hope III, which came several months after the end of a conflict known as the Toyota War. The Toyota War. Over an 8-month period starting in late 1986, a conflict known as the Toyota War was fought in northern Chad and along the Chad-Libya border. It came following Libya's occupation of a region in northern Chad known as the Alzu Strip in 1983, and was named for the Toyota pickup trucks the Chadian forces used in their fight against the Libyans. Throughout the war, the Chadians received immense support from the United States and France, while Libya was backed by Soviet-made military equipment. Much of this equipment was captured by the Chadians and/or abandoned by the Libyans during the conflict. It was a Soviet-made MI-25 helicopter in particular that inspired the top-secret US mission, codenamed Operation Mount Hope III. The Toyota War ended with a major victory for the Chadians, who only suffered 1,000 losses. Meanwhile, the vastly outnumbered Libyans suffered a crushing defeat, which included the loss of at least 1/10 of their army, or around 7,500 men and $1.5 billion worth of military equipment. The end of the war marked the end of a series of clashes between Chad and Libya, but the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States remained alive and well, and would soon give rise to the American military's clandestine plan to acquire a Soviet helicopter under the cover of night. The MI-25 Hind and the Chadian-Libyan conflict. Known by the NATO reporting name Hind, the MI-25 is one of the designated export versions of the Soviet-built MI-24 military helicopter. By definition, it's a helicopter gunship, attack helicopter, and low-capacity troop transport vehicle. Dubbed the Flying Tank by Soviet pilots, development on the Mi-24 began during the early 1960s. A mock-up of what would eventually become the Mi-24 was unveiled in 1966. Its designer, aerospace engineer Mikhail Mil, developed it with a few key points in mind. He had noticed a trend toward ever-increasing battlefield mobility, which translated in his mind to the need for flying infantry fighting vehicles that were capable of providing both battlefield support and for infantry transport missions. Mil died in 1970, but work on the aircraft continued. The final product, aka the Mi-24, also known by its export designations MI-25 and MI-35, was introduced in 1972. It had no direct Western counterpart. In other words, there was no Western version of the MI-24, and nothing even close to it. During the later stages of the Cold War, it came to play an imperative role as a Soviet workhorse and was eventually adopted by other countries' militaries. The MI-25 Hind eventually came to play a significant role in the Chadian-Libyan conflict, which was actually a series of conflicts that began long before the Toyota War back in 1978. The Chadian-Libyan conflict began with Libya's repeated interventions in the Chadian civil war that was ongoing at the time. 2 years into the conflict, Libyan forces began using both the Mi-24 and Mi-25 variants. The choppers made their first appearances during the Battle of N'Djamena in October 1980. 7 years later, during the Toyota War, the US and French-backed Chadian armed forces of the north recaptured the military stronghold of the Wadi Daum in northern Chad, bringing the decades-long succession of conflicts between Chad and Libya to an unceremonious end. In addition to its use during the Chadian-Libyan conflict, the Mi-24 saw combat in 1977 during the Ogaden War, when it was used by pro-Soviet Ethiopian forces against Somalia. The aircraft and its export variant were also used during the Soviet War in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989, the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted from 1980 to 1988, the Nicaraguan Civil War, which also lasted from 1980 to 1988, and the Sri Lankan Civil War, which lasted from 1979 to 2009. Before we continue, we just wanted to say thanks for watching. We appreciate our viewers. And if you're not subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Why steal an Mi-25? During the late 1980s, the Cold War was nearing its end, but it wasn't over, and the decades-old rivalry between the USSR and the United States was as alive and well as ever. Much like modern-day Russia, the Soviets were notoriously secretive about their technological developments, or as one might say, they kept their cards close to their chest. This was especially true when it came to the Soviet Union's military advancements. In order to learn anything about these well-kept secrets, Western countries were left with few other choices than to hijack an example of the sought-after machinery themselves. During the Vietnam War and other 20th century conflicts, the United States acquired plenty of examples of Soviet small arms. During the 1980s, US forces even managed to get their hands on a T-72 main battle tank, MBT. But for the most part, the Americans had failed to obtain large pieces of Soviet-designed military equipment, including any helicopters, despite their numerous failed efforts. When they realized that the Libyans had left behind an operational Mi-25 after the Toyota War, they saw the opportunity to steal it. By doing so, the Americans would obtain an unprecedented look at a large piece of Soviet machinery that, until then, had been inaccessible. Preparing for Operation Mount Hope III. In what went down in history as one of the most brazen recent military heists, more than 60 Night Stalkers went up against sandstorms and faced the threat of opposing Libyan forces in order to steal a Mi-25 Soviet-built attack helicopter that the Libyans left behind during the Toyota War. By getting their hands on Soviet technology and reverse engineering it, the Americans planned to learn more about it. Also known as the Hind Heist, the plan was codenamed Operation Mount Hope III. In fact, the US had long hoped to acquire an Mi-25 Hind, and now they finally had their chance. A previous attempt to obtain one of the choppers had failed after having to cut up the vehicle for transport, which rendered it non-airworthy. In other words, it couldn't fly, so a do-over was necessary, and this time the helicopter would have to be transported by some other means, all in one piece. Prior to moving forward with the new plan, US, French, and Chadian officials engaged in lengthy three-way negotiations. Chad eventually gave the Americans the go-ahead to take the Mi-25 from the military installation at Wadi Daum. In return, the US government handed over $2 million and a supply of missiles. To avoid a repeat of past problems, the plan involved airlifting the Mi-25, And to prevent any mistakes that could jeopardize the mission, the military called on the Night Stalkers to carry out the operation. Training for Operation Mount Hope 3 began in April of 1988, a little over 6 months after the end of the Toyota War. To best prepare for the mission, the Night Stalkers disassembled several MH-45 Chinook helicopters and flew them to White Sands, New Mexico, inside a transport aircraft to simulate the initial deployment to Chad. They then performed nighttime flights with the Chinooks, while one of the choppers carried a load of water that was meant to mimic the weight of a Hind helicopter. The flight to acquire the Soviet aircraft would be a complicated route, which would require several landings for refueling. The Night Stalkers factored this into their practice runs. Almost go time. On May 21, 1988, the Night Stalkers received their official order to commence with Operation Mount Hope 3. 10 days later, an advance party arrived in Chad's capital city, N'Djamena. During the second week of June, 2 partially disassembled M47 Chinooks and more than 60 personnel were delivered to N'Djamena courtesy of a C-5 Galaxy military aircraft. While the official plan called for just 1 helicopter, an extra was brought along in case anything went wrong. The Galaxy landed at N'Djamena International Airport at dusk. Military personnel immediately got to work unloading and reassembling the Chinooks. Anything that added unnecessary weight to the choppers was removed, while additional fuel tanks were installed in the cargo areas, enabling each helicopter to carry an extra 600 gallons of fuel. By then, the Libyans had already gone to great lengths to destroy a lot of the military equipment they'd left behind. They did so largely at the Soviet Union's urging, specifically to prevent any recovery efforts that the Americans might undertake. But in the process, they apparently forgot to destroy the one MI-25 Hind helicopter that the US eventually narrowed its sights on. Go time. At midnight sharp, on June 11th, the Chinooks began the 550-mile flight to Wadi Daum. Operation Mount Hope 3 had officially begun. At the time, there were still some Libyan forces in the area, making speed and secrecy crucial to the mission. The Night Stalkers were especially worried that if any Libyan forces caught on to their attempt to retrieve a helicopter, they might bomb any desirable equipment that remained. By the time the actual recovery was underway, an advance team had already traveled covertly to Wadi Daum. They secured the airfield and prepared the Hind helicopter for transport. In doing so, they discovered that the chopper was almost airworthy. In other words, it was almost in good enough condition to fly it rather than airlift it, but not quite. One of its engines had been struck by a bullet, and it was considered too risky to try flying it. Once they arrived on site, both Chinook's additional fuel tanks were removed because they added too much weight for the choppers to lift the Hind. Instead, the Night Stalkers loaded the fuel tanks and the Hind's rotor blades onto a C-130 Hercules transport aircraft and flew them out from the site. With the Hind slung beneath one of the Chinooks, both MH-47 helicopters took off for N'Djamena. Along the way, they stopped twice to refuel from C-130s that the US Air Force had established ahead of time as temporary refueling points. At the second refueling stop, the Americans received backup assistance from a unit of the French Foreign Legion. The French also helped by providing air cover when and where it was needed. Perfect timing. The Chinooks narrowly avoided getting directly caught in a sandstorm as they touched back down at N'Djamena with the Mi-25 Hind in tow. After waiting for the sandstorm to pass, the Americans loaded the Hind onto a C-5 Galaxy transport plane. The 2 MH-47s were partially disassembled and were also loaded onto a second C-5 for transport back to the United States. From there, the 2 C-5s proceeded to Fort Rucker, Alabama, stopping in Ascension Island and Antigua to refuel along the way. The Mi-25 Hind arrived at Fort Rucker on June 16th, 5 days after Operation Mount Hope 3 officially began. In order to properly evaluate the aircraft, it was restored to flying condition. After that, the chopper was taken to the Threat Systems Management Office, where its capabilities were demonstrated to various military units. The Mi-25 was also used in training exercises as a representation of an enemy vehicle. By analyzing the stolen Hind, the military learned that it had truly earned its reputation as a flying gunship. It was heavily armed with a variety of powerful guns, a fixed twin-barrel autocannon, and external stores for carrying multiple types of weapons, including bombs, anti-tank guided missiles, rocket pods, and additional machine gun pods. Since its capture and its time spent as a learning tool, the highly coveted Soviet chopper has found yet a new purpose. In 2012, it was given to the Southern Museum of Flight in Birmingham, Alabama, where it remains on public display to this day. By donating the aircraft, the military enabled it to narrowly avoid its plans to scrap the vehicle.
Ernest Evans was born in Pawnee, Oklahoma in 1908 and was a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation. During his formative years, he lived with his mother and sister. Evans faced prejudices growing up, but he worked hard and graduated from high school. After that, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy. His initial plan was to join the Marine Corps, but he injured his knee in high school. So Evans was appointed to join the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. He then graduated as an ensign in 1931, and while he was in the Navy, he was nicknamed Chief. Before World War II, Evans was assigned to various ships. When the U.S. entered the war, he was serving on the USS Alden, and by 1944, he was commander of the USS Johnston. The Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer that was built in Seattle in 1942. Military historians have noted that the Johnston and similar Fletcher-type destroyers were vital pieces to the U.S. Navy fleet that served during World War II. They were known for being quick and were able to take a great deal of damage from other ships during battle. The ship was named after John Vincent Johnston, a commander of a gunboat during the Civil War. Lieutenant Robert C. Hagen, who served for Evans, apparently had this to say about him. "I can see him now. Short, barrel-chested, standing on the bridge with his hands on his hips." He then said that Evans would give out a running fire of orders in a bull-like voice. It's said that during the commissioning of the Johnston, Evans stated that the vessel was going to be a fighting ship and that he intended to go into harm's way. He then gave the appointed crew the option of getting off the ship if they didn't want to go along with his sometimes risky orders. War in the Pacific. In January and February of 1944, the Johnston was involved in the bombardment of the Japanese at the Marshall Islands and provided support for U.S. troops. And there was similar success in July of that same year when the Johnston was sent to the Solomon Islands. Evans' bravery shined bright on May 16, 1944, when his ship encountered a Japanese submarine. He managed to successfully maneuver the Johnston and dropped depth charges against the enemy sub. The attack resulted in the destruction of the submarine, but all that was visible to the crew of the Johnston was an oil slick. The Johnston's crew also reported hearing a heavy underwater ripple explosion, coupled with the appearance of debris along the surface of the water. This earned Evans the Bronze Star, an award for heroic achievement, and the award's citation praised him for quickly regaining contact with the submarine. The Johnston would go on to join the USS Pennsylvania in July 1944 to bombard Japanese defenses in Guam. And by the end of that month, the Johnston had fired some 4,000 shells. Reclaiming the Philippines. 5 months after his success against a Japanese submarine, Evans and the Johnston had a new mission in the Pacific. They were part of an operation to reclaim the Philippines from Japanese control. The United States had gained control of the Philippines in 1898, following the Spanish-American War. And it was December 1941 when the Japanese launched an assault on the Philippines, which surprised the Filipinos and the American military stationed on the island. By 1944, the U.S. and Great Britain were successful in their island-hopping campaign in the Pacific to weaken the grip Japan had on the Pacific. And the Philippines was key in this campaign. If the Allied forces could claim the island, then they could cut off the Japanese supply lines. The Philippines would be an excellent location for Allied forces to launch missions against Japanese-controlled islands in the area. The waterlocked country was also a point where the Allies could begin their invasion of the island of Formosa, later known as Taiwan. The powers that be weren't certain if the Philippines should be taken by force or if the plans for an invasion should be shelved. It was General Douglas MacArthur who decided on an invasion. MacArthur had fought valiantly against the Japanese in the Philippines in 1942 and vowed that he'd return. It was September 1944 when attacks against the Japanese in the Philippines were launched. Bombing missions by the Allies were also launched, and October 1944 saw fighting on Leyte, an island that's part of the Philippines. And on October 20th, to be exact, an amphibious assault was launched by the Allies on Leyte. The Japanese devised a masterful plan known as Shogo, which was also referred to as Operation Victory. Their strategy aimed to divert the U.S. ships north of the island of Leyte while deploying a powerful fleet of Japanese ships to disrupt the ongoing assault on the island within the Leyte Gulf. Shogo commenced on a promising note as the Japanese successfully diverted the U.S. fleet to the north, creating an opportunity for their battle-hardened ships to advance into the Leyte Gulf and potentially alter the course of the conflict. In that Japanese fleet were 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. And the star of that fleet was the feared Yamato. At 863 feet, 263 meters, the Yamato was one of the biggest battleships in naval history. It was armed with massive guns to intimidate the enemy, and the anti-aircraft guns on the ship were incredibly nasty. When fired, a timed fuse in the shell would be triggered. The shell would then explode in the airspace, filling it with burning steel and shrapnel. Additionally, the Yamato was heavily armored. Those that sailed on the Yamato claimed that the ship didn't have any pitch or roll due to its armor. Sailors felt as if they were standing on firm ground while at sea on the vessel. Also, the ship could move at 27 knots, or roughly 31 miles per hour, 50 kilometers per hour. In 1942, the Yamato became the flagship for the combined fleet under the command of Japan's Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. But on Christmas Day in 1943, the submarine USS Skate, which was patrolling the waters off Truk Atoll in the Caroline Islands, successfully fired a torpedo at the Yamato and did some damage. It was down but not out. So, after repairs, the Yamato went into action in the Philippines under the command of Admiral Takeo Kurita. It would be Kurita that would lead the Japanese ships in what would be the Battle off Samar. And all that was standing in the way of this intimidating Japanese fleet was a ragtag group of U.S. ships, including the Johnston under the command of Ernest Evans. Do you think you have what it takes to command a fleet of battleships? Let us know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Battle off Samar. It was the morning of October 25, 1944, near Samar, when a Taffy 3, a U.S. Navy escort carrier group, noticed anti-aircraft fire in the distance. The Japanese had successfully diverted a main U.S. fleet from the region. However, Taffy 3 wasn't the kind of group to engage with a massive Japanese fleet. Aircraft had encountered the Yamato and their massive armada in the Leyte Gulf near the island of Samar, the third largest in the Philippines. Enemy presence was news to Taffy 3 because they were under the impression that the area was clear of enemy ships. It's rumored that some commanders dismissed the initial reports as mistakes made by U.S. pilots patrolling the region. They believed the pilots mistook U.S. ships as enemy ships. Taffy 3 consisted of the Johnston, 6 jeep carriers, a few destroyers, and a few destroyer escorts. Ernest Evans knew he was outmatched. He understood that the Japanese fleet could easily bombard the soldiers that had made it to Leyte. Evans knew that he had to confront the enemy. He couldn't run away from this battle. If the Japanese were to advance past the Taffy 3, then the U.S. troops that had landed on the Philippines would be in danger of massive bombardments. And this encounter would be known as the Battle off Samar. The U.S. fleet didn't have the firepower or armor for a full-on battle. However, Evans had an advantage with technology. Fire control systems on ships like the Johnston allowed them to fire with greater accuracy than their enemy. So Evans decided to send the Johnston toward the Japanese in a zigzag pattern. It's reported that he said the following to his crew: "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected." Evans knew if he was close enough, he could launch 2 torpedoes. But he also had another plan. He created a smoke screen using the Johnston. It would make it difficult for guns on Japanese ships to be effective. Evans then ordered torpedoes to be fired, and they damaged an enemy cruiser. He also ordered his guns to be fired at the enemy. He gave them everything he had, knowing the Japanese were far more powerful. The Johnston's gunnery officer later recalled, "We felt like little David without a slingshot." Evans ordered the Johnston to move back so they could hide in the smokescreen. But the Japanese fleet fired upon the ship, causing immediate damage. As a result, one of the vessel's 2 engines was lost. So, Evans pulled his ship back into a squall, or violent windstorm, to regroup. They had 15 minutes before the enemy would attack again, and the squall was like a smokescreen because the storm would make enemy gunfire ineffective. For 3 hours, Evans led the Johnston in a valiant fight against the Japanese. Damage to the Johnston was extensive, but Evans still ordered the ship to fight. The Johnston had lost its secondary steering mechanism, as well as its communication lines to engineering and the bridge. The only way he was able to communicate was through an open hatch where he screamed orders. The situation was frantic, but Evans wasn't shaken in the slightest. It's said that Evans had his shirt blown off during the battle, and he lost 2 fingers in the process. The crew fought with bravery and ferocity. But the repeated hits from the Japanese resulted in the loss of power to all 3 of the ship's 5-inch, 13-centimeter guns, and rendered the Johnston's gyro compass completely useless. The USS Hood was also involved in this battle. Hood was a destroyer, and it fired torpedoes at the Japanese fleet as well. This tactic did cause confusion among the enemy as their ships frantically maneuvered from the torpedoes, which halted their attack. However, when the Japanese regrouped, they opened fire on the Hood, and unfortunately, it too took heavy damage during the battle while on a zigzag course. The Japanese continued their attack by firing torpedoes toward the US fleet. The ships fought in such a manner that Admiral Takeo Kurita, the commander of the Japanese fleet, was convinced he was up against a superior naval force. During the battle, the Johnston suffered extensive damage, leaving Evans with no choice but to abandon ship. The Johnston then rolled over, and as the vessel sank into the ocean, the captain of a nearby Japanese destroyer saluted the crew of the Johnston. Of the 327 men on board, an estimated 186 died, including Evans. 3 other U.S. ships sank that day. But somehow, the bravery of Taffy 3 stopped the advancement of the massive Japanese fleet. In his book, The History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, historian Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison said that no other engagement in the entire history of the U.S. has the country's Navy shown more guts, gallantry, and gumption than in the Battle off Samar. Sam Evans, head of the Naval History and Heritage Command, discussed the battle off Samar and the legacy of Ernest Evans with an Oklahoma newspaper. He said, "This key battle in the Pacific War was almost a disaster for the United States." And he goes on to say that if it hadn't been for the actions of Evans, the battle would have gone much worse. Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery. He was also the first person of Native American ancestry to earn this honor for the U.S. Navy. His citation basically says that despite facing heavy damage from the intense enemy barrage, he fearlessly and without hesitation joined fellow members of his group in providing fire support during subsequent torpedo attacks against the Japanese forces. Evans was praised for outstanding and outmaneuvering the enemy as he consistently interposed his vessel between the hostile Japanese fleet and U.S. carriers, despite the crippling loss of engine power. The USS Evans was named in his honor and was a destroyer escort. The vessel was in service for the U.S. Navy from 1955 until it was scrapped in 1968. The Yamato, on the other hand, was in service until it was sunk in April of 1945 during a fierce battle. The wreckage of the USS Johnston was discovered in 2019. It's considered to be one of the deepest shipwrecks at 21,180 feet. 6,460 meters. A submersible research vessel called the Petrel was sent down by an exploration team to examine the wreckage. They were able to identify the ship by its assigned number, which apparently is still visible. The pilot of the submersible explained to the BBC that the wreck is so deep that oxygen is scarce, and because of this, the ship has remained remarkably preserved, despite its encounters with the turbulent waters of an intense battle. Wreaths were placed in the ocean by the exploration team to honor those who lost their lives on the Johnston. Ernest Evans and his crew were part of a battle that's been overshadowed in World War II history. The odds were against them, but they put everything on the line for freedom. And the sacrifices made by our military and these men will never be forgotten. Do you have any other amazing military leaders you'd like us to make a video about? Let us know down below in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.